was reflecting last night on this process and speaking aloud about it before, understanding other things. This happens usually at night. Sometimes I have these monologues where things congeal and I don't always record them. Sometimes they last a substantial amount of time. In this particular one of the things I was considering was this concept of gangsterization or the narco cartelization of the United States and other areas. I've been kind of trying to articulate this for a while, and so it ends up getting more specific sometimes as I revisit it. One of the concepts of what I've observed is almost a type of turf war that happens not so much about bounded geography as much as about political or human capital. This, for instance, is a particular domain or sector where there is an attempt to establish who has authority. And part of the establishment of authority is based upon a demonstration of loyalty that is often exhibited both by a particular kind of racial performance that somehow has been determined to be appropriate for that specific sector, and or an agreement to violate policy or even the law knowingly as a demonstration of your willingness and readiness to take command from that whom you've acknowledged as the authority in that realm, i.e., the turf. And so, depending upon where you are in the different section, there is an understanding that once you've been identified racially, there are certain expectations of what your performance is. And then depending upon your relationship within the authority structure, there are certain ways that you're expected to engage with others in their racial performance. And your cooperation by playing your racialized role with them playing their racialized role, and then demonstrating your loyalty based upon following commands or complying with processes even if they violate policy and or the law, means that you have acknowledged who has authority within that turf, i.e., a form of gangsterization. You're identified almost as part of or a member of a racialized gang or a gang based on race or ethnicity. And depending upon your performance within that realm and the way that you are acknowledged or not by the authority that has been established in that realm, you may be an ally with another gang or you may be in opposition. And then there's another expectation of what your racial performance is in that regard. And I've seen this happen all over Texas. And it was different in Chicago, but it was a similar sort of scenario in Chicago. And unfortunately, because of the lack of actual engagement in a political movement and actually the intentional depoliticization, especially when it's discussion of or attempts to acquire actual material resources. This is not about some kind of racial cohesion or racial justice strategy. This is a turf war. And so, how does one comport themselves? Well, I'm very bad at demonstrating my loyalty, and I have a horrible racial performance. And it's been strange for me to try to figure this out, except that I've noticed something, and this is where it gets to the quick, which has to do with this concept of racially appropriate acts of terrorism. What is white terrorism? By and large, I believe the expression of domestic terrorism, white domestic terrorism, usually comes in the form of the solo shooter. While they may talk about, the KKK every once in a while, or they may talk about these armed militias, by and large, there is a particular kind of archetype that is by and large associated with white supremacy, that also has a archetypical reference to or in regards to association with symbology that's usually identified as white supremacist, but that also might be considered sacred iconography from various kinds of ancestral or spiritual traditions of people that might have been phenotypically white skinned, i.e., people from the Nordic areas or the Celtic areas or the Gaelic areas or parts of, Germanic Europe or even the Slavic areas, where the same kind of symbolism in a context of what's associated with Native American, for instance, may not have the same sort of connotation as being about an expression of supremacy or even so much an identification with a gang affiliation, in the same way that the same symbology that is identified with somebody who's white skin is associated as an expression of or signification of identification with white supremacy. So this brings up what I was speaking about before, the young man from Texas who was accused of being involved in the of white supremacist inclinations before he engaged in the school shooting. The concept of the vest is that in a lot of the back end coding of the programming languages, one of the major things they reference is this concept of Kevlar. It's a specific coding term. It has a specific implication in terms of the application within the program. Now, if you're not looking at and reading the back-end code, that's one thing. But I've already understood, and I've already experienced personally in my life, and I've experienced it in observations of other people, how even the code running in the background of something like a YouTube feed has some kind of unconscious manifestation. And the primary consideration or association one would have with Kevlar would be a Kevlar vest, like a Special Forces vest, or like something that the SWAT team would wear. And so if you don't come from a culture, or you don't come from a context, maybe you have people in your family, maybe you've had a particular kind of experience where cops or police or members of the military are not necessarily hostile to your way of being, or maybe they may be a consideration in regards otherwise to how you would understand your concept of belonging to a tribe or to belonging to a culture. The unconscious expression of Kevlar might actually be a literal vest. And then you reinforce that vest with sacred iconography that speaks to your spirit. You have a powerful spirit, a powerful soul. So this is just an example. The single crack of lightning through the sky at night speaks something to you and resonates with you naturally, and maybe as part of some sort of cultural or ancestral tradition that you actually have in your family. And so you want to fortify. You want to create your own Kevlar, put on the armor of the Lord, for instance. And so somehow this is allowed to get directed into somebody spying on a young man and understanding that he's looking up feeds associated with white supremacist organizations. They didn't notice this or figure this out until after he shot up the school. Why? How was a young person who had the kind of obvious spiritual inclination he did to seek out to fortify himself with a Kevlar vest that had associations with sacred iconography, was he able to get access to the arms? Was he able to figure out how and when to get to the school? Was he able to assess the actual setup? Was he able to identify targets? These are all, in some cultures, incredibly important skills. These are the kinds of things that define people as communities. It's concepts of how you determine what you're going to do for national defense or how you're going to problem solve and troubleshoot, right? So this is a particular kind of leadership that has been allowed to be primarily associated with white people and has also been demonized or identified as a threat. And so then the question becomes, well, is there something comparable to the solo school shooter that is that tactically sophisticated in other communities? And why is it not allowed to be characterized as terrorism in the same way? Right? If my experience is that by and large, these kinds of acts of terrorism in other kinds of communities are differently characterized. There's not really the same kind of acknowledgement, for instance, of that kind of tactical sophistication and also capacity for terror, by the way, in non white communities. There's not that concept of the solo, meaning sovereign or autonomous, tactical, effective leader in terms of eliminating a problem, for instance, as it could otherwise be characterized and nurtured. Where is that in other communities? Well, instead we see, and I'm just going to have to say it like I understand it, is that a lot of these representations of terrorization, especially concerning African American communities that are concentrated in urban centers, are usually associated with some sort of herd or pack mentality, like a gang. You got a crew of guys and may be involved in some sort of situation on the street, but you don't hear about the same sort of premeditated effort to go in and